At first, this story will seem like a pretty ordinary missing persons case. That is, until you reach the very end. Let's just say this story has one heck of a plot twist. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. As well as this very special episode of a new format I'm calling You Can't. If you're a fan of my YouTube channel, you know that I've told several stories that revolve around places you can't go and people who went there anyways. And I decided to tell some stories like that here on this podcast, but a little different. These are stories with some very unique twists, like today's. They aren't going to be the exact same type of stories you're used to hearing on YouTube, but trust me, you will remember these. And if it seems like people enjoy this particular format, we will continue to add them periodically on this podcast, just to give you even more of the Mr. Ballin stories that you love. So, if that's of interest to you, on the next hot summer day, open a can of sardines and pour the juice into the follow button's air intake of their car. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of March 11th, 1900, 43-year-old Carrie Selvage stared out her bedroom window into the front yard of the building where she lived, in Indianapolis, Indiana. The sun shined bright on her face, but it was surprisingly cold for March, and there was a chill in Carrie's room. She wore a heavy flannel blue dress and slippers, but she still shivered as she stood by the window. Carrie heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a young woman standing there. Carrie smiled, exposing her gold filling and several false teeth that she barely even noticed anymore. The young woman smiled back and then put her hand on Carrie's shoulder. To someone walking by, this might have looked like two friends enjoying the view outside the window. But that's not what was happening here. Because the building where Carrie lived was not her home. It was the Union State Hospital, a turn-of-the-century sanitarium, which today would be called a psychiatric hospital. Carrie was a patient, and the young woman standing with Carrie was a nurse, whose job was to keep an eye on Carrie basically all the time. And Carrie hated it here. Up until a year ago, Carrie had been a school teacher, saving money and building a life for herself. But over time, Carrie had become overwhelmed and sad, and she couldn't even explain why. She felt tired, but she struggled to sleep, and there were days when she just felt sort of frozen, like she couldn't leave the house. Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with Carrie other than some problems with her vision and her teeth. So, the doctors did something that was unfortunately pretty common at this time for women. They diagnosed Carrie with hysteria and told her family to put her in an institution. That was how Carrie had lost her teaching job and her freedom and ended up living here at Union State. Now, in Carrie's room, the nurse told her that she had to go check on another patient. She told Carrie not to go anywhere until she got back. Carrie nodded and watched the nurse walk out of the room and close the door behind her. Once Carrie was alone again, she turned back to the window and looked outside. Her eyesight was terrible, so the view was not clear, but she could still make out people down below on the sidewalk walking past her. They looked like little blurs, but she watched each one for as long as she could. She felt jealous of these people, out walking by themselves. Carrie desperately wanted to go somewhere on her own, where nurses and doctors weren't hovering over her every few minutes and telling her what she could and couldn't do. She pressed her face up against the window, picturing the city she had once known so well. The streetcar rolling down its tracks, people rushing off to work, her students yelling and laughing in the schoolyard. And as she was having these thoughts, something else suddenly popped into her mind. She believed there was one particular place where, if she could just get there, she could once again experience the freedom she longed for. Just then, Carrie turned away from the window and walked over to her door. She opened the door halfway and leaned her head out, making sure nobody was in the hallway. Once she was sure the coast was clear, Carrie took a breath, lowered her head, and walked out of her room. About 5 minutes later, that same nurse came back to Carrie's room and opened the door. But now, Carrie's room was empty. The nurse walked over to the closet, opened the door, and checked inside, but Carrie wasn't in there either. The nurse wasn't alarmed. She was annoyed. Carrie had run away once before, and this nurse knew that if it happened again, she was going to have to explain why she left Carrie alone. The nurse checked the porch, where she knew Carrie liked to spend time, but it was also empty. She told herself what must have happened was a doctor came by and took Carrie somewhere. But when this nurse tracked down all the doctors on the shift, they all said the same thing. They hadn't seen Carrie all morning. Now, this nurse was starting to panic. She worried that Carrie might have tried to walk somewhere on her own and gotten completely lost because of her terrible eyesight. And so, not knowing what else to do, the nurse ran to the front desk and said she needed help right away, because Carrie Selvage had disappeared. At 6 p.m. that night, so about 8 hours after Carrie had stepped out of her room, her younger brother Joseph walked into the lobby of Union State Hospital, and it was pure chaos. Joseph saw doctors, nurses, and administrators walking as quickly as they could down one hall and into another, and everybody looked frantic. But nobody had contacted Joseph, so he did not know what was going on. He eventually flagged down a nurse and told her he was there to visit his sister, and that's when the nurse told him. His sister Carrie was missing. Joseph felt a pang of fear. He asked the nurse sharply what she meant. The nurse was clearly nervous as she explained that Carrie had wandered off. But she rushed to tell Joseph the entire staff believed that Carrie was probably still on the grounds, so there was no real need to worry. Joseph stared at the nurse with his mouth open. He was shocked. But more than that, he was mad. He had felt terrible for his big sister that she had ended up in this hospital in the first place, and he hadn't given up hope that she could maybe recover and return to the life that she had been building. He knew she was unhappy here, and now she was potentially in danger. Joseph collected himself enough to speak and said to the nurse, "Go get the police." Later that night, Detectives Chauncey Manning and Adolph Ashe of the Indianapolis Police Department arrived at Union State Hospital. Both men wore dark, well-tailored suits and hats. They were experienced investigators and had worked as partners on a range of cases. The detectives quickly met with the medical staff, who gave them a rundown of Carrie's known movements. The detectives also found Carrie's brother, Joseph, standing in a common room by the porch. He had refused to go home and was insisting that he wanted to be part of the search. Because no one had actually seen Carrie leave, the detectives decided the first priority was to search the hospital itself, even though staff had already looked. So, with Joseph and several other hospital employees following them, Detectives Manning and Ashe checked every patient's room one by one, including the closets. Then, after they did not find Carrie, they walked through the common areas and offices, bending down to search behind every piece of furniture. And when that didn't work, lastly they searched the stairways and took oil lamps up to the attic. But again, there was no sign of Carrie. Finally, Detective Manning told Joseph that they couldn't do much more tonight, but he promised that they would resume and expand their search for his sister first thing in the morning. What they didn't tell Joseph was that if Carrie had truly wandered off the hospital grounds and out into the city, then she was in very serious danger. Like other major cities, Indianapolis had its share of crime. Pickpockets and thieves were common, and violence against women was a growing problem. Carrie would be an easy target. But beyond that, at this particular moment, the city was also dealing with a truly bizarre rash of crimes. a gang of grave robbers were digging up bodies and then selling them on the black market to hospitals and universities that use the bodies for medical research. And in some cases, if a fresh body was required, these gangs would take things into their own hands and actually commit murder in order to provide that body. On the morning of March 12th, so still less than 24 hours after Carrie had gone missing, Detectives Manning and Ash, along with a group of uniformed police officers, began canvassing the surrounding neighborhood outside of the hospital, hoping they weren't already too late. And pretty quickly, they began finding witnesses. A young boy who'd been outside at the time when Carrie had disappeared said he did see a woman in a blue dress, just like the one Carrie was wearing, running down the street right across from the hospital. And a woman who lived nearby said she'd also seen the woman wandering down the street a couple blocks away. Now, this information didn't make it any clearer where Carrie was right now, but it at least gave the detectives some hope that they were finally on her trail. So the detectives wanted to get Carrie's image in front of as many people as possible. But back in 1900, reproducing photographs was not nearly as fast or easy a process as it is today. However, photography had recently become more affordable for people, and newspapers regularly ran photos along with their articles. So, the detectives met with Carrie's brother, Joseph, and got photos of Carrie that they could reproduce as cards to show people around the city. They would also put these photos in the local papers. In the week following Carrie's disappearance, Manning, Ash, and their team walked the city, knocked on doors, and showed Carrie's picture to everyone. But nobody else beyond those initial witnesses had seen her. 2 weeks after Carrie's disappearance, on March 25th, the detectives still had no real leads, and they were getting desperate. By now, they had searched the hospital and its grounds several times. They had crisscrossed the city, dragged small ponds, and conducted hundreds of interviews. At this point, they could only think of one other place to look: the canal that cut through town, that also was not far from the psychiatric hospital. In 1900, very few women were taught how to swim, so Manning and Ash thought Carrie might have wandered near the canal, and with her limited vision, and potentially with her inability to swim, she could have not seen the water, fallen in, and drowned. So, the detectives had city workers drain the entire canal. And then after it was drained, they led a group of volunteers through the mud looking for Carrie's body. But after hours and hours of searching, they hadn't found any sign of her. As more weeks passed with no new leads or evidence, the search began to lose momentum. Carrie's brother, Joseph, had started his own campaign, going to different newspapers and asking them to keep putting photos of Carrie front and center. Through his efforts, thousands of people had seen Carrie's photograph, which was a shocking level of publicity for the year 1900. Carrie's face was by now well known across the city. But despite all this, by April of 1900, so about a month after Carrie's disappearance, the newspapers and detectives moved on, and Carrie's case went cold. Joseph and his family never stopped believing that Carrie was out there somewhere, and so every so often, over the next several months, they would put an article in the paper with a message to Carrie in it, promising that if she came out of hiding, she wouldn't have to go back to the hospital. She could come home instead. But Carrie never did. Fast forward 2 years to a day in September of 1902, inside of an operating theater at a hospital right near the one Carrie had disappeared from. A medical student wove through the crowd to a front row seat in the theater, which gave him a clear view of the operating room right below. The student felt his heart speed up, because in the center of the operating room, he saw a table covered with a bright white sheet, and he knew that underneath that sheet, there was a dead body. He and his fellow medical students had come to the operating theater today to watch a skilled surgeon dissect a real human corpse. This demonstration was, at the time, one of the only ways that doctors in training could gain a better understanding of human anatomy. And it was considered a huge privilege for them to get to witness something like this. The sound of footsteps echoed from below, and immediately the audience fell silent. The student saw the surgeon approach the operating table, and he listened closely as the surgeon explained what they could all expect to see during this demonstration. Then the student watched as the surgeon stepped up to the operating table and removed the white sheet, revealing the pale face of the corpse underneath, with a gold tooth glinting from its open mouth. The student had expected to feel amazement when he saw the body, but instead, he felt an unsettling wave of déjà vu. Something about the corpse's face looked familiar to him, but he just couldn't place it. Then, suddenly, it just came to him, and he yelled it out without even meaning to. "It's the missing woman!" he shouted. Some of his classmates laughed uncomfortably, thinking maybe he was making a very bad joke. But the surgeon called for quiet and asked the student what he was talking about. The student stood up and said he would recognize that face anywhere. The woman on the table was Carrie Selvage, the same Carrie Selvage who had disappeared from the psychiatric hospital a couple years ago. Her photograph had been plastered all over the city. Suddenly, all the other students in the operating theater all began talking at once as they leaned forward to get a better look. They all remembered the missing woman, whose brother had given what felt like 50 interviews. And they agreed the corpse on the table looked just like Carrie, down to the gold tooth. Eventually, the surgeon called out to the students to quiet down and clear out of the operating theater. The surgeon had no idea if the med student was right, but he was not about to continue with this demonstration until he checked. A few hours later, Detectives Manning and Ash stood in the operating theater with the surgeon, Carrie's brother Joseph, and Carrie's dentist. All the men stared at the body on the table, and they all had the same reaction. It could be Carrie, but they weren't sure. The medical school had not kept great records on when it actually acquired these bodies. This particular one was slightly decomposed and had been frozen for a long time. The dentist eventually spoke up and said the gold filling was the same kind he'd used for Carrie, and it was in the exact same spot in her mouth. At this, Detectives Manning and Ash walked away from the table and huddled together in a corner to whisper to each other, occasionally taking a look back to make sure nobody, especially not Joseph, was listening. They did this because what they were discussing was incredibly upsetting. Manning and Ash knew that medical schools and hospitals had a hard time acquiring dead bodies for research through legal means, so these institutions often turned to the black market and grave robbers for their supply. In fact, during the initial investigation, they had worried that Carrie might have been the victim of grave robbers, who were known to occasionally commit murder in order to increase their supply of dead bodies. Now, the detectives knew they were going to have to step into this dark, bizarre world of grave robbers to get answers. And there was one man in particular they were going to have to talk to. His name was Rufus Cantrell, but the media and the police called him the King of Ghouls. Rufus Cantrell was actually already in jail, so it was easy for Manning and Ash to find him. In just a few hours after they had stood over the corpse in the operating theater, they walked into an office in the jail and sat down at a table across from the man they thought could break their case open for them. Now, Rufus had a reputation for being violent and sort of unhinged, so the detectives were surprised that he was in a very relaxed, almost jovial mood when they met him. He told Manning and Ash that he would help them in any way he could. Manning was suspicious of this level of cooperation, but he still told Rufus all about the dead woman in the operating theater, doing his best to describe the woman's appearance and her teeth. Rufus nodded along as Manning spoke, and then when Manning was done, Rufus said he knew exactly who the detective was talking about. That was the woman who'd gone missing from the psychiatric hospital over 2 years ago. Manning looked at Rufus skeptically and asked how he could be so sure. and then he watched as a wide, unsettling smile spread across the King of Ghouls' face. Rufus said he was sure because members of the grave robbing gang he was a part of had murdered her. At this, Manning and Ash just stood there, staring in shock at the grave robber in front of them. The detectives had come here expecting a very confrontational interview, not an immediate and creepily cheerful confession. They actually didn't even know what to say. So, after a moment of silence, Rufus just kept on talking. He said he personally had not had anything to do with the murder. All he knew was that his band of grave robbers had spotted a woman in a blue dress wandering along a country road and decided she was an easy target. And they had been right. They had attacked her and then dragged her to a house they worked out of in the city, and once they got there, they clubbed her to death, and then put out the word in their network that they had a fresh body for sale. Rufus said that was when he had found out about this, around the time they were actually trying to sell the body. He said that all he had done was actually help arrange the sale of Carrie Selvage's body to the hospital. And then after her body had been sold, it would sit frozen for 2 full years until finally, today, it had been scheduled for dissection. Detectives Manning and Ash left the jail feeling a bit blindsided. They knew there were countless reasons not to trust Rufus. He was already in jail, for one thing, and probably thought that talking to detectives, especially about a case they were really interested in, might get him out. And then there was the fact that this guy, Rufus, had literally sold dead bodies on the black market, and he was possibly a total psychopath. But the murder scenario Rufus had outlined was something the detectives themselves had considered. And in the weeks following that interview, the detectives actually had Rufus lead them, along with Carrie's brother Joseph, to the house where Rufus claimed the murder took place. And there they would find a club, as well as pieces of women's clothing. So, although Manning and Ash still remained skeptical of Rufus's story, the King of Ghouls had given them just enough evidence to finally close the case. Carrie Selvage was officially declared dead. But there was just one problem, and that was that Carrie's brother, Joseph, absolutely refused to believe it. Now, Joseph didn't have a good alternate theory about what happened to his sister, but the grave robber story made no sense to him. Carrie had bad eyesight and she was generally nervous and unhappy, but she wasn't stupid. She'd grown up in the city and knew not to wander alone at night down country roads. Plus, he knew Rufus had gotten a lighter sentence in return for his story and cooperation, so how true could it really be? And also, part of Joseph just wanted to believe that his sister had escaped the hospital and found the freedom she so desperately wanted and was now off living happily and choosing not to let anyone find her. And Joseph would hold on to this belief for a long time, until... on April 26, 1920. So over 20 years after Carrie's disappearance. On that day, Joseph got an urgent and confusing telephone call from the police at his home. An officer said he'd heard from a construction company that was working on a building in town. It was an orphanage that they were converting to an automobile repair shop, and this construction crew had found something that Joseph just needed to see. Joseph ended the call and headed straight to the building, having no idea what he was about to find. Once outside the orphanage, Joseph walked past several construction workers and then stepped inside the building. Right away, he heard somebody call his name, and he looked over to see a man with thinning white hair walking towards him. Joseph squinted, looked at the man's face, and then suddenly he recognized him. It was Detective Manning. Now, Joseph felt a jolt of adrenaline. Whatever this was, it had to be about his sister. Joseph asked Manning if Detective Ash was here too, but Manning just shook his head and said no, Ash had passed away a few years earlier. Before the two men could really talk, they were joined by a member of the construction crew, who handed them each a flashlight and gestured for them to follow him. As Joseph walked through the building, He could see that the construction crew had already made a lot of progress, but it still looked like parts of the building hadn't changed in decades. And it was one of these old, untouched areas of the building where this crew member led Joseph and Manning. And when they got there, the crew member pointed to an old stairwell set against a wall, signaling for Joseph to climb up the stairs. Joseph hesitated, but only for a second. Then he took a deep breath and slowly walked up the steps. When he reached the top, he found himself standing in a dark, narrow hallway with a low ceiling that made him feel totally claustrophobic. Joseph bent down, but it still felt like the ceiling was pressing in on him. And as he walked down this hallway, shining his flashlight from side to side, it almost looked like the walls were closing in. Joseph felt his chest tightening. This place was cramped and pitch black, and even though he knew it was ridiculous, he had this feeling like he could get stuck here. But finally, his light caught something at the end of the hallway. It was a small door built into the wall ahead of him, and it looked just big enough for him to fit through. Joseph reached the end of the hall and caught his breath. Then he opened the door and squeezed through. He stumbled forward and found himself inside of a cold, damp room that was only about 4 feet by 6 feet. But unlike the hallway, it wasn't dark and stuffy. Instead, sunlight flooded this room through 2 windows. It was bright, and the air was fresh. Joseph flipped off his flashlight and began turning in a slow circle, surveying the room. And halfway through the circle, he froze. At this moment, Joseph knew he had been right for decades. That grave robber, the king of ghouls, Rufus Cantrell, had lied. The body on that table in the operating theater had not been his sister's. Because leaning against the wall inside of the small room, Joseph saw the skeletal remains of a woman, with tattered pieces of a blue flannel dress clinging to her bones and 2 old slippers lying at her feet. Joseph turned away from the skeleton towards the window. Through it, he could see almost the entire city, and Joseph started crying. Because now he understood that as much as he'd wanted to believe it, his sister Carrie had never escaped and found her freedom. Because it would turn out that the orphanage that Joseph had come to, where he climbed the old stairwell and found his sister's body, had once been the Union State Hospital, the psychiatric institution where Carrie had been committed. The hospital had shut down not long after Carrie disappeared, and the building had been used for several different things in the years that followed. And now, the construction crew that was converting it into an automobile repair shop had discovered this old staircase by accident. And that staircase led to a tiny hidden room that was located up above the attic and that had windows to the outside. Joseph and the detectives had searched the hospital attic on the day Carrie went missing, but they hadn't noticed this staircase. So they didn't know that Carrie had actually been right there, just above them, the whole time. The official report on Carrie's death would later conclude that her terrible eyesight had led her to become lost and wind up in this room and not know how to get out again, and then she froze to death. But, as always, Joseph did not accept the official statement. In fact, he would spend years coming up with theories of his own. But there was one theory that couldn't be ignored, and that was that maybe Carrie didn't get confused and stuck inside the room because she couldn't see. Maybe, when she crawled into that secret room, she had known exactly what she was doing. Because Carrie had almost certainly been alive throughout the entire search of the hospital. Staff, police, and her own brother had been just feet away. But she never once called out or made any noise. So maybe Carrie had just decided to sit there quietly, looking out the window and across the city where she'd once been free. And when night fell and she felt that bitter cold coming on, she chose to stay in that room. The only place she knew where she could be on her own and where nobody would tell her what she could and couldn't do. On April 30th, 1920, 4 days after the discovery of her remains, Carrie Selvage was buried next to her mother and finally laid to rest. As for the two witnesses who said they had seen Carrie basically right after she had gone missing, running down the street, had simply been mistaken. And the dead woman who had been on the operating table at the Westside Medical Clinic was never identified. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and also Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Our first story takes us to the quiet suburbs of Tokyo, specifically to a place called Mitaka. It was April 23, 1994. The sun was not quite up yet, and a light, persistent rain was falling over Inokashira Park. This is a beautiful, sprawling space, famous for its pond and its cherry blossoms. It is the kind of place where families go for swan boat rides and students go to study. It is peaceful. That morning, a 60-year-old park cleaner named Mitsuko was starting her usual shift. Mitsuko had been doing this for years. She knew every path, every tree, and every one of the green plastic trash bins scattered throughout the grounds. She was working near the sports field, moving slowly through the drizzle, her yellow raincoat rustling with every step. She reached one of the bins and saw several translucent plastic bags piled near the top. This was normal. People often left their picnic scraps or convenience store packaging there, but as she reached in to pull one out, she noticed it felt heavy. It was dense. She looked through the plastic and saw what she thought was high-end meat, or perhaps some large fish discarded by a local restaurant. It looked very clean. It was pale, almost white, and it was cut into a very specific shape. Mitsuko was a bit annoyed. She thought a local butcher or lazy restaurant owner was using the park bins to save on commercial waste fees. She opened the bag expecting to find the smell of rotting fish or raw beef, but there was no smell. There was nothing. She reached in and realized that the object inside was a human foot. She did not scream right away. The shock was too cold for that. She just stared at it. The foot was perfectly clean, there was no blood on it, no dirt, and the skin was a haunting porcelain white. It looked like it belonged to a mannequin except for the weight and the texture. When the police arrived and began a systematic sweep of the entire park, they realized Mitsuko's discovery was just the beginning. They started opening every single trash bin in the massive park, and in 17 different bins, they found the rest of the bags. There were 27 bags in total. And inside those bags was what remained of a man named Seiichi Kawamura. Now, to understand why this case is so haunting, you have to understand who Seiichi was. He was 35 years old, and he was a successful architect. He was a tall, handsome man, well-liked by his colleagues and deeply loved by his family. He did not have enemies. He did not owe money to the Yakuza. He was not involved in any strange cults. He was a man of logic and structure, a man who spent his days designing buildings and ensuring every measurement was correct. He was last seen the night before April 22 around 11 o'clock. He had been out for a few drinks with some old friends near the station. He was in a great mood. He said his goodbyes, walked toward the train station to head home, and then he simply vanished. In the 20-minute window between that station and his front door, something happened to him. And whatever happened, it was carried out by someone who possessed a terrifying level of skill. When the medical examiners laid out the 27 bags in the morgue, they were stunned. They were used to seeing messy crimes, the kind born of passion or rage. This was the opposite of that. This was clinical. Every single piece of Saiichi's body had been cut to an exact length of 20 centimeters. Not 19, not 21, exactly 20 centimeters. It was as if the person who did this had used a ruler for every single slice. The bones had been severed with an industrial-grade electric saw or a specialized medical tool, and the cuts were so clean they looked polished. But the most disturbing detail was the blood, or rather, the lack of it. Seiichi Kawamura had been entirely drained of blood, every single drop. In a typical body, there are about 5 liters of blood, and when a person is dismantled, it creates a scene of absolute carnage. But these bags were dry. The tissue was pale because it had been washed, perhaps even chemically treated. The person who did this had access to a sterile environment, likely a medical lab or a high-end butchery, and they had the patience to spend hours, maybe the entire night, processing Seiichi like a piece of wood in a factory. The police were looking for a motive, but the more they looked at the body, the less sense it made. The killer had physically peeled the skin off the pads of the fingers and toes to remove the fingerprints. They had removed every identifying mark, yet they left the bags in public trash bins where they were guaranteed to be found within hours. It was a contradiction. It was a display of absolute power. It was as if the killer was saying, I can take an ordinary man, I can take him apart with mathematical precision, and I can put him right back in the middle of your peaceful park, and you will never know who I am. Detectives interviewed over 37,000 people. They checked every medical student, every butcher, and every person with a history of violence in the area. They looked into the 2 men a witness reported seeing in the park around 4 in the morning, carrying a heavy bag, but the descriptions were too vague to lead anywhere. The timeline was impossible. For one person to kidnap a grown man, transport him to a secure location, drain his blood, measure and cut him into 27 perfect pieces, and then distribute those pieces across a massive park in a single night. They would have to be more than just a killer. They would have to be a ghost. One theory that floated through the investigation was that Saiichi had been mistaken for someone else. Some people pointed to a high-ranking member of a foreign intelligence agency who lived nearby and looked remarkably like him. They wondered if Seiichi had been snatched by mistake, taken to a black site, and then disposed of once the mistake was realized. It would explain the surgical tools and the lack of a traditional motive, but in the end, that was just a theory. As the years passed, the file on Seiichi Kawamura grew thick with dead ends. In Japan, there used to be a statute of limitations for murder, and for this case, that clock ran out in the year 2009. That means even if the killer walked into a police station today and confessed they could not be prosecuted, the case is officially closed. It is a perfect crime preserved in the archives of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. Today, if you go to Inokashira Park, you will see the same green trash bins. You will see people jogging, couples walking, and children playing near the sports field. It is still a beautiful, peaceful place. But for those who remember 1994, the park feels a little different when the rain starts to fall and the light gets gray. They look at the clear plastic bags in the bins, and they wonder about the architect who was turned into a puzzle. And they wonder if the person who carried the ruler that night is still out there walking among them, still obsessed with the perfect measurement. The silence of that park is heavy, but it is nothing compared to the silence of a crowded city. While Tokyo's mystery was defined by its clinical quiet, our next story takes us to the heart of London, where a brutal crime was committed in front of dozens of people. And yet the silence of the crowd proved to be just as deadly as the killer's blade. September 3, 1991 was a bright, unusually warm Tuesday in London. Penny Bell, a 43-year-old mother of two and a very successful businesswoman, was at her home in Buckinghamshire. Penny was the kind of person who had her life completely under control. She ran a successful catering and secretarial agency. She had a loving husband named Alistair, and she was known for her punctuality. If Penny said she would be somewhere at 10, she was there at 9:55. That morning, she seemed a little bit on edge. She was looking at her watch more than usual. Around 9:45, she told her husband she had to leave for a secret meeting. She did not say who it was with, only that it was important and that she would be back later. This was not entirely strange for a woman in her position, but the way she said it felt a little off. She got into her blue Jaguar XJS, a beautiful luxury car that stood out on the road, and she drove out of the driveway. Penny was seen a short time later at a local gas station. Witnesses said she looked flustered. She was seen driving her Jaguar slowly down the road with the hazard lights blinking, which usually means a car is having mechanical trouble, but she did not stop at a garage. Instead, she was seen with a man in the passenger seat. They were talking. A few minutes later, she pulled the Jaguar into the parking lot of the Grinnell Leisure Center in Perivale. This was not a secluded spot. It was a busy leisure center with people coming and going, families taking their kids to the pool, and people heading to the gym. It was broad daylight right around the middle of the day. Penny parked the car perfectly in a parking space. And that is where the normalcy ends. A short time later, a passerby walked past the blue Jaguar and happened to look through the window. They immediately staggered back in horror. Penny Bell was slumped over the steering wheel. The interior of the luxury car, which had been pristine just hours before, was now a nightmare of red. Penny had been stabbed over 50 times. The attack had been incredibly violent, a frenzied explosion of rage that must have taken several minutes. The police were baffled. How could someone be stabbed 50 times in a busy parking lot at high noon without anyone seeing it? There were people just yards away. There were people in the cars parked next to her. Yet no one reported hearing a scream. No one reported seeing a man covered in blood stepping out of a Jaguar and walking away. It was as if the killer was invisible. When detectives started looking into Penny's life, they found a detail that changed everything. A few days before she was killed, Penny had gone to her bank and withdrawn £8,500 in cash. At the time, that was a huge amount of money. She had not told her husband about it, and the money was never found. This suggested that she was being blackmailed, or perhaps she was involved in a business deal that she needed to keep quiet. The police found a single bloody handprint on the passenger window of the car. It was smeared as if someone had leaned against the glass while the attack was happening. They felt sure this was their golden ticket. But when they ran the print, it did not match anyone in the national database. They interviewed thousands of people, they appeared on television appeals, they even questioned a man who had been a suspect in another high-profile murder, but they could never place him at the scene. The most chilling part of the Penny Bell case is the psychological aspect. She clearly knew her killer. She let them into her car, she drove them to that parking lot, she sat there with them, perhaps talking about the money, and then, in a place surrounded by life and laughter, she was erased. The killer did not care about the witnesses, they did not care about the daylight. They knew that in a crowd, people often see only what they expect to see. And no one expects to see a murder in a blue Jaguar on a sunny afternoon. Somewhere in London, that Jaguar was eventually cleaned and sold. It is probably still on the road today, just another car in the traffic. But for the Bell family, every time they see a blue car or a busy parking lot, they are reminded that you can be surrounded by people and still be completely alone. From the crowded streets of London, we move now to a place where the landscape is wider and the shadows are much longer. We are going to South Africa, a country of incredible beauty, but also a place where in the late 1980s, a hunter was moving through the suburbs looking for a very specific kind of prey. In this story, the disappearance of 6 girls would lead to a chase that ended in a hail of bullets, leaving a nation with a hole in its heart that has never been filled. Between 1988 and 1990, A wave of fear washed over the cities of South Africa. It started with a 14-year-old girl named Joan Boyson. She was walking home from a friend's house in the late afternoon. It was a route she had taken 100 times, but she never walked through her front door. A few months later, another girl, Anne Mari, vanished. Then another and another. 6 girls in total, all young, all with their whole lives ahead of them. There were no ransom notes. There were no bodies found in the brush. It was as if these girls had simply been plucked off the face of the earth. The police were under immense pressure, but they had very little to go on until a girl named Joan Louise vanished. This time, a witness had seen her talking to a very polite middle-aged couple in a car. They looked like a normal suburban husband and wife. The man was Gert van Rooyen, and the woman was his girlfriend, Joey Harhoff. Gert was a man with a dark history, someone who had been in trouble with the law before, but he had managed to keep a low profile. He and Joey lived in a house in Pretoria that looked like every other house on the block. But behind those walls, things were very different. When the police finally linked the couple to the disappearances, they moved in fast. In January of 1990, the police spotted Gert and Joey in their vehicle. A high-speed chase erupted through the streets. It was like something out of a movie, but the stakes were real lives. As the police began to corner the car, they expected a standoff. They expected to take them into custody and finally get the answers to where the 6 girls were being held. But Gert van Rooyen had a different plan. As the police closed in, he pulled out a firearm. He did not point it at the officers. He turned it on Joey and pulled the trigger. Then, before the police could even reach the car, he turned the gun on himself. In a matter of seconds, the only 2 people who knew the truth were dead in the front seat of their car. The silence that followed those gunshots was deafening. The police immediately rushed to Gert's home. They called it the House of Horrors. They expected to find the girls locked in a basement or a hidden room. They did find a secret space under the floorboards, and inside they found the girls' belongings. They found school uniforms, books, and small trinkets that belonged to the missing children. But the girls themselves were nowhere to be found. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in South African history. They literally tore the house down. They dug up the entire yard, they searched the foundations, and they even searched the nearby dams and forests. They found nothing. No remains, no further clues. This led to a series of dark theories that still haunt the country today. Some people believe that Gert and Joey were not working alone. They believe they were part of a much larger, more powerful pedophilia ring that involved high-ranking government officials from the apartheid era. The theory is that the girls were sold and moved out of the country, and that Gert was killed or killed himself to ensure the secret never came out. Decades later, the families of those 6 girls still have no closure. They don't have graves to visit. They only have the school portraits of their daughters' 6 smiling faces pinned to a police corkboard that has grown yellow with age. The girls remain missing, frozen in time, while the world moved on. Sometimes the secret is hidden by a predator who takes it to the grave, and sometimes the secret is hidden by the very system that is supposed to protect us. In our next story, we travel to Thailand, where the disappearance of a young woman named Cherry Ann Duncan would reveal a level of corruption that ruined more lives than just her own. 1986 in Bangkok was a time of rapid growth and chaos. Cherry Ann Duncan was 19 years old, an office worker who was known for being the pillar of her family. She was hardworking, beautiful, and had a bright future. One afternoon, she clocked out of her office, walked toward a waiting taxi, and was never seen alive again. A few days later, her body was found in a thick, muddy mangrove swamp in Samut Prakan. She had been strangled. The public was outraged, and the police were under massive pressure to find a killer. They needed a win. So they found one. They arrested 4 men and claimed they had an eyewitness who saw these 4 men snatch Cherry Ann off the street. The men were thrown into a brutal prison system. They were tortured. They were beaten until they signed confessions for a crime they did not commit. One of the men died in his cell from the abuse. Another was beaten so badly he became permanently paralyzed. For years, they sat in prison, their lives destroyed, while the public believed justice had been served. But years later, a new team of investigators took a second look at the case. They found that the eyewitness was a professional liar who had been paid by the police to point the finger at those four men. The entire case was a fabrication. When the men were finally released, they were shadows of their former selves. They walked out of prison into a world that had moved on without them mourning the years they could never get back. The real investigation finally began, and it did not lead to a gang of kidnappers. It led back to Cherry Ann's personal life. It turned out she had been seeing a married man, and his wife had a very clear motive. The crime was not a random act of violence, it was a targeted hit born of jealousy. But because the police were so focused on a quick arrest, the real killers were able to hide in plain sight for years. The Cherry Ann Duncan case became a landmark in Thai history, leading to massive judicial reforms. It served as a dark reminder that sometimes the search for justice can become a crime itself. The mud of the mangroves eventually washed off, but the stain on the system never truly faded. In Thailand, the truth was hidden by corruption, but in our final story, the truth was hidden by something much more literal: a wall. A wall made of concrete iron and the cold ideology of a country that no longer exists. This is the story of two girls in East Germany whose lives were taken in a place that was supposed to be the safest on earth. August 4, 1986, Weimar, East Germany. This was the era of the DDR, a time when the state monitored everything. The Stasi, the secret police, were everywhere. People were told that their country was a socialist utopia free from the capitalist rot of crime and violence. It was supposed to be the safest place for a child to grow up. 10-year-old Melanie and 13-year-old Carola were best friends. It was a hot summer day, and they decided to go down to the local river to swim. They grabbed their towels and their leather sandals and headed out. When they did not come home for dinner, their parents went looking for them. They found the riverbank quiet. Sitting neatly on the grass were two pairs of small leather sandals, but the girls were gone. A massive search was launched, but it was handled with typical East German secrecy. The state did not want the public to know that a predator might be loose. 2 days later, the girls were found in a nearby forest. They had been assaulted and murdered. The investigation was intense, involving the Stasi, but they could not find a match. The wall was still up and the country was closed. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The DDR ceased to exist. The files of the Stasi were opened, and the case of Melanie and Carola was moved into the hands of the new unified German police. For 30 years, the case sat cold. The girls' clothes were kept in storage, waiting for technology to catch up with the crime. In 2018, it finally did. Using modern DNA techniques, investigators found a match on Melanie's clothing. They arrested a man who had been living a normal life for decades. The nation held its breath. It seemed like after 30 years, the ghosts of Weimar would finally get justice. But when the case went to court, it fell apart. Because the evidence had been handled by the Stasi in 1986 under different forensic standards, the defense argued that the DNA had been contaminated over the years. The court agreed. There was no secondary evidence, no witnesses left alive, and no confession. The suspect was acquitted. He walked out of the courtroom a free man. The realization was devastating. The killer had lived a full life. He had seen the fall of his country, the reunification of Germany, and the turn of a new century, all while Melanie and Carola remained 10 and 13 years old. The predator had exploited the gaps in a collapsing system and the passage of time to escape. The river in Weimar still flows today. It is still a place where children go to swim on hot summer days. And sometimes, if you look at the grassy bank, you might see a pair of shoes left behind by a child who is cooling off in the water. But for the people of Weimar, those shoes will always carry a different meaning. They are a reminder of the two girls who never came back to put them on, and a reminder that even behind the strongest walls, the darkness can always find a way in. September 3, 1991 was a bright, unusually warm Tuesday in London. Penny Bell, a 43-year-old mother of two, was at her home in Buckinghamshire. Penny was the kind of person who had her life completely under control. She ran a very successful catering and secretarial agency. She was deeply involved in her community. She had a loving husband named Alistair, and she was known by everyone for her meticulous punctuality. If Penny said she would be somewhere at 10 o'clock, she was there at 9:55. She was not the kind of person who made careless mistakes, and she was certainly not the kind of person to leave things to chance. But that morning, she seemed a little bit on edge. She was looking at her watch more than usual, pacing slightly around the house. Around 9:45, she told her husband she had to leave for what she called a secret meeting. She did not say who it was with, only that it was important and that she would be back later. This was not entirely strange for a woman in her position. She was a businesswoman, and dealing with confidential clients or surprising the family with a new project was something she might do. But the way she said it, the hurried tone in her voice, felt a little off. She grabbed her keys, got into her pale blue Jaguar XJS, a beautiful luxury car that stood out on the road, and drove out of the driveway. Penny was seen a short time later by a neighbor and then by other drivers on the road. Witnesses said she looked flustered. She was seen driving her Jaguar very slowly down the road with the hazard lights blinking. Usually, that means a car is having mechanical trouble or the driver is trying to signal for help, but she did not pull over, she did not stop at a garage. Instead, a witness saw something that changed the entire context of that morning. There was a man in the passenger seat. They appeared to be talking or perhaps arguing as the car crawled along the street. A few minutes later, Penny pulled the Jaguar into the parking lot of the Gurnell Leisure Centre in Perivale. This was not a secluded dark alley, it was a busy leisure center with people coming and going constantly. Families were taking their kids to the pool, people were heading to the gym, and cars were fighting for parking spots. It was broad daylight, right around the middle of the day. Penny parked the car perfectly in a parking space right out in the open. And that is where the normalcy of Penny Bell's life ended forever. A short time later, a passerby was walking to their car when they happened to look through the window of the pale blue Jaguar. They immediately staggered back. Penny Bell was slumped over the steering wheel. The interior of the luxury car, which had been pristine just hours before, was now a nightmare. Penny had been stabbed over 50 times. The attack had been incredibly violent, a frenzied explosion of rage that must have taken several minutes to carry out. The blood was everywhere, painting the inside of the windows and soaking the leather seats. When the police arrived, they were completely baffled. How could someone be stabbed 50 times in a busy parking lot at high noon without anyone seeing it? There were people just yards away. There were people in the cars parked next to her. Yet, no one reported hearing a scream. No one reported seeing a struggle. And most impossibly, no one reported seeing a man covered in blood stepping out of a pale blue Jaguar and walking away. It was as if the killer had simply evaporated into the warm September air. Detectives started looking into Penny's life, desperate to find a reason for such a personal, brutal attack. They found a detail that changed the direction of the investigation. A few days before she was killed, Penny had gone to her bank and withdrawn £8,500 in cash. At the time, that was a huge amount of money. She had not told her husband about it, and she had not deposited it anywhere else. When her body was found, the money was gone. This suggested that she was not the victim of a random carjacking, she was being blackmailed, or perhaps she was involved in a private transaction that she needed to keep quiet. Forensic teams went over the Jaguar inch by inch. They found a single smeared bloody handprint on the passenger window, as if someone had leaned against the glass from the inside while the attack was happening. They felt sure this was their golden ticket. They ran the print through every database they had. They interviewed thousands of people. They appeared on national television, pleading for anyone who was in that parking lot to come forward. They even questioned a man who had been a suspect in another high-profile murder, thinking there might be a connection, but they could never place him at the scene, and the handprint never matched anyone in the system. The most chilling part of the Pennybell case is not just the violence, but the psychology of the crime. She clearly knew her killer. She let them into her car, she drove them to that parking lot, she sat there with them, perhaps talking about the money, and then in a place surrounded by life, laughter, and ordinary people, she was erased. The killer did not care about the witnesses. They did not care about the bright daylight. They knew that in a crowd, people are often too busy with their own lives to notice what is happening right next to them. They knew that a busy place is sometimes the easiest place to hide. Somewhere in London, that pale blue Jaguar was eventually cleaned, auctioned off, and put back on the road. It is probably still out there today, just another car sitting in traffic or parked outside a supermarket. But for the Bell family, every time they see a blue car or every time they walk through a busy parking lot, they are reminded of a terrifying truth. They are reminded that you can be surrounded by dozens of people in the middle of the day and still be completely desperately alone. While Pennybell's story shows how someone can vanish in a crowd, our next story takes us to the vast landscapes of South Africa, where disappearing isn't just a choice, it's a hunter's game. The year was 1988, and the setting was South Africa. To understand this story, you have to understand the atmosphere of the country at that time. It was a place defined by high walls, deep divisions, and a constant underlying sense of tension. But in the quiet, sun-drenched suburbs of cities like Pretoria and Johannesburg, life for many families still felt predictable. Children walked to school, played in the parks, and wandered between neighbors' houses without a second thought. There was a sense of community that felt bulletproof. But that year, the air in those suburbs began to change. It started with a girl named Joan Boyson. Joan was 14 years old. She was a typical teenager, full of energy and plans for the future. On a warm afternoon in 1988, she was walking home from a friend's house. It was a route she knew by heart, a path she could probably walk with her eyes closed. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. You can imagine the sound of her footsteps, the occasional dog barking behind a garden fence, the distant hum of traffic. Everything felt normal. But Joan never walked through her front door that evening. She simply vanished. At first, the police and the community tried to rationalize it. They thought maybe she had run away, or perhaps there had been an accident they hadn't discovered yet. But then, a few months later, it happened again. 12-year-old Anne-Marie Wapenaar disappeared. Then 13-year-old Odette Boucher and 9-year-old Rosa Piel vanished. By the time 12-year-old Yolanda Wessels and 12-year-old Joan Louise Marais were gone, a heavy, suffocating blanket of fear had settled over the entire country. 6 girls were gone. 6 families were living in a permanent state of waking nightmare. There were no ransom notes. There were no bodies found in the vast South African bush. It was as if a hole had opened up in the middle of the suburbs and swallowed these children whole. The police were under immense pressure. They were looking for a monster, but what they found was a man named Gert van Rooyen and his girlfriend, Joey Harhoff. If you saw them at a grocery store, you wouldn't have looked twice. Gert was 52 years old, a man who had spent time in construction. He was polite, soft-spoken, and appeared to be a family man. Joey was 44, his constant companion. They looked like an average middle-aged couple you might see at a Saturday morning market. But behind that ordinary outer layer, something was very wrong. The breakthrough came when a girl managed to escape. She provided a description of a man and a woman who had offered her a ride, a couple who seemed helpful and kind until the car door locked. This led the investigators directly to Gert and Joey. On January 15, 1990, the police finally spotted their vehicle. They knew they had their suspects, and they knew that inside that car were the answers to where those 6 girls were being kept. The police units moved in, and a high-speed chase erupted through the streets of Pretoria. It was a desperate, violent pursuit. You can imagine the sound of the sirens wailing through the afternoon air, the tires screeching as Gert pushed the car to its limits. The officers were focused on one thing: taking them alive. They needed to know the locations. They needed to know if the girls were still alive. As the police began to corner the vehicle, pulling it to a halt, they prepared for a standoff. They stepped out of their cars, weapons drawn, shouting commands. But Gert Van Royen was not going to go quietly, and he was not going to talk. In a sudden, jarring movement, he pulled out a firearm. He didn't point it at the police. He turned it toward Joey and pulled the trigger. Before the officers could even reach the car door, Gert turned the gun on himself. 2 gunshots rang out, and then there was absolute chilling silence. When the police reached the car, they found Gert and Joey dead in the front seats. The only 2 people who knew exactly what had happened to those 6 girls were gone. They had taken their secrets with them in a matter of seconds. The investigation immediately shifted to Gert's home at 67 Milan Street in Pretoria. The media began calling it the House of Horrors. The police were convinced that the girls, or at least evidence of their fate, were hidden somewhere on that property. They moved in with a level of intensity that the country had never seen. They didn't just search the house, they began to take it apart piece by piece. They found a hidden room under the floorboards, a dark, cramped space that felt like a tomb. When they opened it, the smell of stale air and dust hit them. Inside, they didn't find the girls. Instead, they found their belongings. They found school uniforms that were still neatly folded. They found small trinkets, books, and items that the girls had been carrying on the days they vanished. Seeing those ordinary objects in that dark hole was almost more disturbing than finding nothing at all. It confirmed that the girls had been there in that house right in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. But as they continued to search, the mystery only grew deeper. The police brought in heavy machinery. They literally tore the house down. They excavated the entire yard, digging deep into the orange South African soil. They searched the swimming pool, the foundations, and the garden walls. They used ground-penetrating radar. They dug and they dug until the property was nothing but a massive empty hole in the ground. They found nothing else. No remains, no further clues. This lack of evidence birthed a series of dark theories that still circulate in South Africa today. Because Gert and Joey were dead, and because no bodies were ever found, people began to wonder if they were part of something much larger. At the time, South Africa was in the final volatile years of the apartheid era. Rumors began to spread that Gert and Joey were recruiters for a high-level pedophilia ring that involved powerful government officials and members of the elite. The theory suggested that the girls hadn't been killed in that house, but had been sold and transported out of the country, possibly to the Middle East or Europe. Some believed that Gert's suicide wasn't an act of desperation, but a final order to ensure that the names of the people who bought those girls would never be revealed. It was a theory that pointed toward a massive cover-up, one that reached into the highest offices of the land. But without Gert or Joey to testify, there was no way to prove it. For the families of Joan Ann Mari, Odette Rosa, Yolanda, and Joan Louise, the end of the police chase was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of torture. In most true crime cases, there is a trial, a sentence, or a grave. There is a place to go to process the grief. But these families had none of that. They were left in a state of permanent limbo. They had to live with the knowledge that their daughters had been in that house on Milan Street, and then they had simply vanished again. The case remains officially unsolved. The girls are still listed as missing persons. Over the years, there have been occasional leads, a bone found in a garden, a tip from an old prisoner, but they always lead to nothing. The House of Horrors was eventually completely demolished, and for a long time, the lot stood empty, a scar in the middle of the suburb. Today, those 6 school portraits still hang on a wall in a police station in Pretoria. They are 6 smiling faces frozen in time from 1988 and 1989. They look like they are about to say something, about to head off to a birthday party or a sports match, but the world they belong to is gone, and the man who took them made sure that no one would ever find out where they went. 6 girls walked into a shadow, and the shadow was folded up and tucked away forever in the front seat of a car on a Pretoria street. The silence they left behind is a weight that the country still carries. In South Africa, the truth was buried by a man who chose death over confession. But in our next story, we go to a place where the truth was hidden by the very people whose job it was to uncover it. We are going to Thailand, where the disappearance of a young woman would lead to a search for justice that turned into a second, even more systemic crime. 1986 in Bangkok was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, you had the modernizing skyline and the rising skyscrapers, and on the other, you had the ancient crowded streets filled with the smell of exhaust fumes and spicy street food. It was a place where things moved fast, and if you were not careful, you could get lost in the shuffle. 19-year-old Cherry Ann Duncan was someone who understood exactly what it took to stay afloat in a city like that. Cherry Ann was young, striking, and incredibly hardworking. She was an office worker, a position that carried a certain amount of prestige for a girl from her background. Every morning, she would put on her crisp white office blouse, pin back her hair, and head into the heart of the city. She was the primary breadwinner for her family. She was the one who made sure the bills were paid and the future felt secure. People who knew her described her as responsible, focused, and maybe a little bit too mature for her age. She had to be. On a July afternoon in 1986, the humidity in Bangkok was like a wet blanket. Cherry Ann finished her work, gathered her things, and walked out of the office building. This was her routine. She would usually catch a taxi or a bus and head straight home to Samut Prakan, a province just on the outskirts of the city. A few coworkers saw her walking toward the street looking for a cab. She flagged one down, climbed into the back, and the door clicked shut. It was a completely ordinary moment in a city of millions. But that was the last time anyone saw Cherry Ann Duncan alive. When she did not come home that evening, her family did not panic immediately. Bangkok is a city of legendary traffic jams. It is not unusual for a commute to take 2 or even 3 hours if the rain is heavy or a road is blocked. They sat in the living room, watching the clock, waiting for the sound of her key in the lock. But as midnight came and went, the silence in the house became heavy. They called her friends, her coworkers, anyone they could think of. No one had seen her. By the next morning, the police were involved. A few days later, the search ended in the most horrific way possible. A fisherman working near a mangrove swamp in Samut Prakan noticed something caught in the thick gray mud near the water's edge. At first, he thought it was a piece of discarded plastic or a sack of trash. But as the tide pulled back, he saw the sleeve of a white blouse. The police arrived and waded into the thick, sulfurous mud of the mangroves. It is a harsh environment, the roots of the trees are like tangled fingers, and the mud is deep and suffocating. They pulled the body out and confirmed what everyone feared. It was Cherry Ann. She had been strangled. There was no signs of a robbery. Her jewelry was still on her. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was something much more deliberate. The news of the murder hit the Bangkok papers like a lightning bolt. A young, beautiful office worker snatched in broad daylight and dumped in a swamp. It was the kind of story that terrified the public. People were afraid to take taxis. They were afraid to let their daughters go to work. The pressure on the Royal Thai police was immense. The headlines were demanding an arrest, and they were demanding it immediately. The police captain in charge of the case knew that his career was on the line. He needed suspects, and he needed them to look guilty. Within a short period, the police announced they had cracked the case. They arrested 4 men, Rungchai Phitak and 2 others. These were not hardened criminals. They were ordinary men, some of them working-class guys just trying to get by. But the police claimed they had a star witness, a man who said he had seen these 4 men kidnap Cherry Ann. The men were brought into interrogation rooms that were hot, cramped, and filled with the smoke of cheap cigarettes. They were told that if they confessed, things would go easier for them. When they refused, the interrogation turned into something much darker. In the 1980s, the methods used in those rooms were not always recorded, and they were rarely gentle. The men were beaten, they were kept awake for days, they were threatened with execution. Eventually broken and terrified, they signed confessions. The trial was a sensation. The public wanted blood, and the prosecution gave it to them. The eyewitness stood on the stand and pointed his finger at the four men. Based almost entirely on that testimony and the forced confessions, the men were sentenced to long terms in a high-security prison. The case was closed. The police were heroes. The public felt safe again. But for the four men, the real nightmare was just beginning. They were sent to a prison where the conditions were beyond belief. The heat was stifling, the cells were overcrowded with dozens of men sleeping on concrete floors, and disease was rampant. They were treated as the lowest of the low because they were girl killers. Rungchai, one of the men, did not survive the experience. He died in his cell from a combination of untreated illness and the physical toll of the beatings he had received. Another man, Fitak, suffered such severe injuries during his time in custody that he became permanently paralyzed. Their families were destroyed, their reputations were gone, and they were rotting in a hole for a crime they had never committed. While they were suffering in prison, the real story of what happened to Cherry Ann Duncan was still buried in the mud of that mangrove swamp. It would take years for the truth to start leaking out. It started with a lawyer and a few persistent investigators who realized the police's story did not make sense. They started looking into the star witness and found something startling. The man was a professional liar. He was someone the police had used before. He had been paid a significant amount of money to testify against the four men. He hadn't seen a kidnapping at all. This revelation opened a floodgate. A new investigation was launched, one that was not looking for a quick headline, but for the truth. They looked into Cherry Ann's life more deeply than the first team ever had. They found that she had been involved in a complicated relationship with a married man. He was wealthy and influential. But more importantly, his wife was a woman who was known for her fierce temper and her protectiveness over her marriage. The pieces started to fit together. Cherry Ann had not been snatched by four random men. She had been targeted. The theory emerged that the wife had hired a professional hitman to take care of the problem. Cherry Ann was picked up in a car, not a random taxi, and taken to the mangroves where she was killed. The corruption was systemic. The police had likely known from the beginning that the four men were innocent, or at least they didn't care if they were. They needed a group of people who had no power, no money, and no way to fight back. They needed scapegoats to satisfy the public's rage, while the real perpetrators, people with money and connections, remained untouched. Years later, the remaining men were finally released from prison. The Thai Supreme Court overturned their convictions, admitting that the entire case had been a tragedy of errors and corruption. The men walked out into the sunlight as free men, but they were broken. They were middle-aged, now their health was gone, and their friend was dead. The compensation they received from the government could never replace the years they had spent in a concrete box. The Cherry Ann case became a landmark in Thai history. It led to massive reforms in how police investigations are handled and how witnesses are vetted. It is taught in law schools as a warning of what happens when the desire for a win becomes more important than the search for the truth. But for Cherry Ann Duncan, justice was never fully realized. The people who actually pulled the string, the ones who paid for the hit, were never properly brought to account. The trail had gone too cold, and the evidence had been too badly mangled by the initial corruption. If you visit the mangrove swamps near Samut Prakan today, you will see the thick, gray mud and the tangled roots of the trees. It is a quiet, eerie place. The mud eventually washed off the white blouse of a 19-year-old girl, but the stain on the system, the knowledge that 4 innocent lives were sacrificed to cover a lie that never truly faded. In Thailand, the truth was hidden by the people in power. But in our final story, we go to a place where the truth was hidden by a wall made of concrete iron and the cold ideology of a country that no longer exists. This is the story of 2 girls in East Germany who went for a swim and walked into a mystery that would survive the fall of an entire nation. August 4, 1986, Weimar, East Germany. This was the era of the DDR, a time when the state monitored everything you did. The Stasi, the secret police were everywhere. People were told that their country was a socialist utopia, a place where the capitalist rot of the West, the crime, the violence, the drugs, simply did not exist. Because of this, parents felt a sense of security that is hard to imagine today. It was supposed to be the safest place in the world for a child. 10-year-old Melanie and 13-year-old Corolla were best friends. They lived in a world of uniforms, school clubs, and state-sanctioned activities. It was a hot, beautiful summer day, and they decided they wanted to cool off. They told their parents they were going down to the local river to swim. They grabbed their towels and their leather sandals and headed out into the sunshine. When the girls did not come home for dinner, their parents did not immediately think of a predator. They thought maybe they had wandered too far or were staying late at a friend's house. They went down to the riverbank to look for them. The water was calm, reflecting the late afternoon sky. There, sitting neatly on the grass near the water's edge, were two pairs of small leather sandals. They were lined up perfectly as if the girls had just stepped out of them and were about to come back any second. But the girls were nowhere to be found. A massive search was launched. In East Germany, when something like this happened, the Stasi took over. But they did not want the public to know. They did not want people to realize that a killer could exist in their perfect society. 2 days later, the search ended in a forest not far from the river. The girls had been assaulted and murdered. The investigation was intense, but it was shrouded in secrecy. The Stasi checked everyone, but they were looking for a specific type of person, someone who did not fit the socialist ideal. They collected evidence, they took samples, but they could not find their man. And then, the world changed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, the DDR collapsed, the Stasi files were opened, and the case of Melanie and Corolla was handed over to the new unified German police. It was a cold case, now a relic from a country that no longer existed. For 30 years, the case sat in a file cabinet. The girls' clothing and those small leather sandals were kept in an evidence locker, waiting for the day when science could do what the secret police could not. In 2018, that day finally arrived. Using modern DNA technology, investigators found a tiny trace of biological material on Melanie's clothing. They ran it through the national database, and they got a hit. A man was arrested. He was an elderly man, now someone who had been living a quiet, unremarkable life in Germany for decades. The nation held its breath. It seemed like a miracle. After 30 years, the ghosts of Weimar were finally going to get their day in court. People expected a confession, a resolution, a closing of the circle, but when the trial began, the darkness of the past reached out to pull the case apart. The defense lawyers argued that because the evidence had been collected in 1986 by the Stasi, a police force known for its lack of modern forensic standards and its potential for political interference, the DNA could not be trusted. They argued it had been contaminated in the evidence lockers over the decades. There were no other witnesses left, no secondary evidence, and the suspect maintained his silence. The court had no choice. Under the strict rules of German law, the evidence was not enough. The suspect was acquitted. He walked out of the courtroom a free man. The realization was a punch to the gut for the families. The man who likely killed those girls had lived a full life. He had seen the fall of the wall, he had seen the birth of a new country, and he had grown old in the sunshine, all while Melanie and Corolla remained frozen at the ages of 10 and 13. He had exploited the gaps in a collapsing system to disappear. The river in Weimar still flows today. It is still a place where children go to swim on hot days, and sometimes, if you look at the grass, you might see a pair of shoes left behind by a child who was cooling off in the water. But for the people who remember 1986, those shoes will always be a reminder that some mysteries are not solved by time, they are only buried deeper by it. August 4th, 1986 was a day that felt like it was standing still in Weimar, East Germany. If you have ever been to that part of Germany in the middle of summer, you know the kind of heat I am talking about. It is a thick, heavy heat that settles over the stone buildings and the narrow streets, making the air feel like it has weight. In 1986, Weimar was part of the DDR, the German Democratic Republic. This was a place where life was governed by a very specific set of rules. The state, through the Stasi, the secret police, kept an eye on almost everything. But to the people living there, it did not always feel like a police state. To many, it just felt like home. And home was supposed to be the safest place on earth. In the socialist ideology of the time, things like serial killers and violent predators were considered a capitalist problem. They were symptoms of a decaying West. In the East, you were told that the community looked out for one another. You were told that crime was something that happened somewhere else. This created a sense of security that, in hindsight, was incredibly fragile. On that Tuesday afternoon, 10-year-old Melanie and 13-year-old Corolla were not thinking about politics or secret police. They were just two best friends who were hot bored and looking for a way to enjoy the summer break. Melanie was the younger of the two, full of energy, always the one ready for an adventure. Corolla was 13, a little more reserved, the kind of girl who felt a sense of responsibility for her younger friend. They were practically inseparable. Around the middle of the afternoon, they decided they had enough of the heat in the house. They gathered their things, their towels, and their favorite pairs of leather sandals, and told their parents they were heading down to the local river to cool off. It was a short walk, a route they had taken many times before. Their parents did not think twice about it. In Weimar in 1986, you did not worry about your children walking to the river. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky and the shadows of the old trees grew long, a different kind of feeling started to settle over their families. Dinner time came and went. In a household governed by German punctuality, being late for dinner was not just unusual, it was a signal that something was wrong. Melanie's parents went to Corolla's house, and when they realized neither girl had returned, the search began. They headed down to the riverbank, calling the girls' names. The water was moving slowly, reflecting the orange light of the sunset. It was quiet, too quiet. As they walked along the grassy bank where the children usually entered the water, they saw something that made their hearts stop. Sitting there, side by side, were two pairs of small leather sandals. They were placed neatly tucked away from the water's edge so they would not get wet. It was such an ordinary, everyday sight, but in that moment it was terrifying. It looked as if the girls had just stepped out of them and were about to come back to put them on, but the river was empty. The local police were called, and because this involved missing children in the DDR, the Stasi were notified almost immediately. The search was massive, but it was also controlled. The state did not want to panic. They did not want the narrative of the safe socialist paradise to crumble. They brought in dogs, they brought in divers, and they searched every inch of that riverbank. For 2 days, the families lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty, holding on to the hope that the girls had simply wandered off or were staying with someone they knew. On the second day, that hope was crushed. The search teams moved away from the water and into a nearby forest, a place with thick undergrowth and heavy canopy. There, hidden beneath the brush, they found Melanie and Corolla. They had been assaulted and murdered. The violence of the crime was shocking even to the seasoned investigators. It was clear that this was not an accident or a moment of panicked rage. It was the work of a predator. The investigation that followed was intense, but it was shrouded in the kind of secrecy that only the DDR could maintain. The Stasi collected everything. They took samples from the girls' clothing, they mapped out the scene with obsessive detail, and they interviewed hundreds of people in the area. They were looking for a man who did not belong, someone who stood out, but in a country where everyone was monitored, the killer seemed to be a ghost. No one had seen a stranger, no one had heard a scream. The files were filled with notes and sketches, but no names. And then the world turned upside down. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The East German government collapsed, and the Stasi ceased to exist. In the chaos of the reunification, many cases were moved, files were lost, or evidence was boxed up and forgotten in the basement of new administrative buildings. The case of Melanie and Corolla became a relic of a country that was no longer on the map. For the families, it was a double tragedy. Not only were their daughters gone, but the system that was supposed to find the killer had vanished along with them. For 30 years, those leather sandals sat in an evidence locker. The case was cold, frozen in the amber of the 1980s. Every few years, a new detective would look at the file, but there was never enough to go on. That is until 2018. By 2018, forensic science had moved into a realm that the Stasi could not have even imagined in 1986. DNA technology had become so sensitive that it could find a match from a single skin cell or a microscopic trace of biological material. A specialized cold case unit in Thuringia decided to take one last look at the Weimar children murder. They took Melanie's clothing, which had been preserved in a sealed plastic bag since the day she was found, and they sent it to a modern lab. They found it, a tiny microscopic trace of DNA that did not belong to Melanie. They ran it through the Unified German National Database, a system that contains the profiles of hundreds of thousands of individuals, and for the first time in 3 decades, the computer screen flashed with a match. The name belonged to a man who was now in his late 60s. He was living a quiet, unremarkable life in a different part of Germany. He had a home, a history, and neighbors who thought he was just a regular elderly man. He had seen the fall of the wall, the birth of the euro, and the rise of the internet. He had lived an entire lifetime while Melanie and Carola were still 10 and 13 in the minds of their families. The police moved in and made the arrest. It was a sensation in Germany. The news outlets called it a miracle of modern science. It seemed like the perfect ending to a nightmare that had lasted 32 years. The man was brought back to Weimar to stand trial. The families, now elderly themselves, sat in the courtroom looking at the man who had supposedly taken everything from them. They expected a confession. They expected the truth to finally come out in the bright light of a modern courtroom. But the darkness of 1986 was not finished with them. During the trial, the defense lawyers launched a very specific and very effective attack on the evidence. They did not argue that the DNA wasn't his. They argued that the DNA was irrelevant because the chain of custody had been broken. They pointed back to the Stasi investigators in 1986. They argued that because the evidence had been handled in a socialist police state that did not follow modern forensic protocols, there was no way to prove the samples hadn't been contaminated. They pointed out that in the 1980s, investigators did not wear the full-body suits, masks, and gloves that are standard today. They argued that the evidence had sat in non-climate-controlled lockers for decades, moved from one building to another during the collapse of the DDR. They suggested that the DNA could have been transferred through a handshake, a shared tool, or even through the air in a poorly managed evidence room. The legal battle was long and technical. It was a clash between the precision of modern science and the messy reality of a collapsing regime. In the end, the judges were faced with a terrible choice. They had a DNA match, but they also had a legal principle that says evidence must be handled perfectly to be used in a conviction. Because the Stasi were the ones who first touched those clothes, the court ruled that the evidence was polluted. There were no other witnesses left. Most of the original investigators were dead or could not remember the details of a 30-year-old scene. There was no murder weapon, and the suspect maintained a cold, absolute silence. He never said a word. In the end, the court had no choice but to acquit him. Due to a lack of usable evidence, the man walked out of that courtroom a free man. He returned to his quiet life, protected by the very laws of the democratic country that had replaced the one where he committed his crime. The acquittal was a second death for the families of Melanie and Carola. It was the realization that the killer had not just taken their daughters' lives, but he had outlasted the very country that tried to catch him. He had used the passage of time and the failure of a fallen state as his final shield. If you go to Weimar today, you can still find the spot by the river where the girls went to swim. It is a peaceful place, and on a hot August day, you will still see children splashing in the water, their laughter carrying through the trees. And if you look closely at the grassy bank, you might see a pair of shoes left behind by a child who is cooling off. To anyone else, it is just a sign of a happy summer day. But for the people who remember 1986, Those shoes are a haunting image. They are a reminder of a day when two girls stepped out of their sandals and into a mystery that would survive the fall of a nation. The river continues to flow, indifferent to the secrets it witnessed. It washes away the footprints, it cools the heat of the summer, and it keeps its silence, just like the man who walked away from the courtroom. The case of the Weimar children remains a cold echo in a unified Germany, a reminder that sometimes the truth is not enough to bring justice home. The river keeps moving, and the shoes stay on the bank, waiting for owners who will never return to put them on. On a night in 2013, a woman in her 30s named Erin heard loud banging on her front door. She opened it up and saw her best friend Robin standing there, and she could tell right away that Robin was terrified. She was shaking, tears were running down her face, and she had scratches all over her arms. Erin led Robin inside to the couch and asked her what was going on. Robin told her that she had just been over at her ex-husband's house to drop off their two daughters, and everything seemed to be fine. But then her ex-husband's new wife came into the room and had just started yelling at her. And before Robin could even say anything, this woman ran across the room and attacked her. Robin said her ex-husband had managed to pull them apart, at which point she had grabbed the kids and left. As Erin sat there listening to this wild story, she actually was not surprised, because she knew the woman Robin had been fighting with. And when Robin was finished talking, Erin told her to never be alone with that woman again, because Erin said that woman was the kind of crazy that will kill you. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button orders delivery, wait until their food is sitting on their porch and then run up and steal it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of April 7th, 2014, 32-year-old Robin Spielbauer tucked her 10-year-old daughter into bed in their house in Amarillo, Texas. Robin told her daughter that she loved her, said goodnight, and then walked out of the room. Robin could hear the TV on in the front room of the house, and she began heading that way, but before she got there, she stopped to look in on her younger daughter. Robin peeked into her bedroom and saw the little girl was already fast asleep. And as soon as she saw this, Robin just felt this complete sense of calm come over her. As a single mother with two young kids, Robin's days could get busy and chaotic. But she was finally able to relax each night when she knew her daughters were safe and sound in their beds like they were right now. Robin left the bedroom and walked down the hall into the front room of the house, where she found her mom and dad watching TV. Robin took a seat on the couch with her parents, grabbed her phone out of her jeans pocket, and quickly sent a text message. Robin's mom looked over and asked her daughter if everything was okay. She was fine, just making some plans. Robin knew her parents loved having her and the two girls in the house, and they played a huge part in helping her take care of the kids. But Robin thought in a perfect world, she would not be living with her parents in her early 30s. Because for many years before she wound up back at her parents' house, Robin had been living a life she loved on her own. When she was 22, she had fallen in love with a great guy named J.D. Spielbauer. J.D. was a former United States Marine and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robin's father had been in the military most of his life, and so her parents had been really happy when Robin started dating a military veteran. Robin got pregnant just 2 months after they started dating, and so she and J.D. had their first daughter, then got married, and then they had their second daughter a few years later. And for Robin, ever since she was young, all she had wanted was to be a mom. And so she didn't really care that she and JD struggled with money sometimes, or that raising kids really wasn't always easy. She and her husband loved each other, and they had these two beautiful girls. That was more than enough to be grateful for. But in 2012, after she and JD had been together for almost 10 years, everything began to change. JD became distant, and he started spending a lot of time away from home. And not long after that, Robin had discovered that JD was cheating on her with a woman named Katie Phipps, who just happened to be one of Robin's friends from church. After Robin had learned that her husband and friend were having this affair, she divorced JD, took the kids, and moved back in with her parents. And not long after that, JD had married Katie Phipps, which really only added to the tension. Back on the couch, Robin's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the text, smiled, and got up. She told her parents she would have to run out for a bit and asked if they could watch the kids while she was gone. Her mom said of course, and then asked if Robin was going out to meet her new boyfriend. Robin blushed a little, but didn't respond. Then she just grabbed her purse, told her parents she wouldn't be gone too long, and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, at about 9:30 p.m., Robin drove her black Chevy Tahoe out of town and turned onto Helium Road, which was a long, winding dirt road surrounded by farmland on both sides. As she drove, Robin cranked up the country music on the radio and looked out at the huge Texas night sky. The only light on the road came from her headlights and the moon, and this made Robin feel like she was out in the middle of nowhere. But that was perfect as far as she was concerned. In fact, that's why she'd chosen Helium Road for this meeting in the first place. She didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do. Eventually, Robin pulled her SUV over to the side of the road, put it in park, and began to wait. And as she did, she listened to the radio and looked out the window, and then eventually, she saw headlights coming down the road behind her. The following day, at noon, almost 15 hours after Robin had left her house, a middle-aged man drove his truck down Helium Road. The sun was bright, and it was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It looked and felt like a perfect spring day. As the man was driving, he spotted something in the distance, so he slowed down and squinted. And he was surprised by what he saw. 3 young girls were running down the road right towards him, and they were screaming. This part of Helium Road was usually pretty deserted, and it wasn't really a place where kids played. So the man immediately hit his brakes, put his truck in park, and stepped outside to see what was going on. He walked over to the girls and asked if they were okay. And without breaking their stride, all 3 girls pointed behind them and started yelling, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man looked where the girls were pointing, and he saw there was a black SUV parked on the side of the road. He told the girls to stay where they were, and then he ran over to the SUV. And when he got there, at first glance, it just looked like somebody had abandoned the vehicle. However, when he walked to the passenger side of the SUV and looked at the ground, he just froze. The man was in total shock at what he saw, and it horrified him that 3 young kids were clearly the first ones to have stumbled onto this scene. The man took a breath and steadied himself, then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. A little later that afternoon, Sergeant Alan Mongold of the Randall County Sheriff's Department sped down Helium Road. Up ahead, he saw there was an ambulance, cop cars, and a fire truck, and then behind him, driving as well, were more police cars. Sergeant Mongold could not think of a time ever when this spot on Helium Road, basically in the middle of all this farmland, had been so crowded. He eventually pulled over and parked his car not far from a black SUV and got out. And immediately, an officer ran over to meet him and said he'd taken statements from the 3 young girls and the man who had been there when he arrived, but he'd arranged for the girls to be taken home and he'd sent that man on his way. Mongold said that was fine, he would follow up with them if he needed to. And then he and the other officer walked around to the passenger side of this black SUV, and they joined a group of paramedics who were already standing there. But as soon as Mongold looked at the ground just outside the car, it was clear the paramedics could not do anything. Because, lying there on the ground, was a woman's body. And based on all the bugs crawling on her, Mangold knew she must have been dead for at least several hours. Mangold put on his gloves and crouched down next to the body. The woman was on her back, and immediately Mangold saw a deep dark bruise on the left side of her head. And at first glance, this bruise did not appear to be something she got just from falling down or something. It looked like something had been smashed into the side of her head, like a heavy object. And so at this point, Mangold felt confident he was very likely dealing with a murder. He reached into the woman's pockets, but found they were empty. So he told one of the officers on hand to run the plates of the SUV. And then he and the others started to do a sweep of the area. Within minutes, Mangold saw the officer who had just run the plates waving him over. Mangold joined him, and the officer said that the SUV was registered to a woman whose name was Robin Spielbauer, and the image of Robin Spielbauer that popped up matched the victim. Pretty soon, members of the county's forensics team arrived, and Sergeant Mangold searched the area around Robin's body and her SUV again. And this time, a forensic tech saw something that seemed really strange. The back windshield of Robin's SUV had a small crack in it, and embedded in the crack were tiny pieces of hot pink plastic. Now, neither the forensics tech nor Sergeant Mangold had any idea what this pink plastic was from. But the tech said hopefully that would become clear after they ran some tests. The investigative team spent hours searching up and down Helium Road, hoping to find a potential murder weapon or maybe Robin's cell phone. But other than those pink plastic flecks on the SUV windshield, there really wasn't much to go on. Mangold considered the possibility that this could have been a robbery gone wrong, that someone had gotten Robin to stop her car, attacked her, and had stolen her purse and her phone. But the idea that a carjacker would choose this road to try to rob someone where there wasn't a whole lot of traffic just didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so Mangold couldn't help but think that maybe Robin's killer was someone she knew. The following morning, April 9th, Sergeant Mangold sat at his desk reviewing the autopsy report. The report stated that Robin had most likely died the night before her body was found, and then her body had just laid outdoors on the side of the road overnight. And even more importantly, the autopsy report confirmed that Robin had been murdered. Because in addition to the blunt force trauma wound that Mangold had found on the side of her head, the medical examiner had also discovered a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol in the back of Robin's head. So, that morning, Sergeant Mangold went to meet with Robin's friends and family to learn as much as he could about her, and also to see if anyone close to Robin owned a .22. Mangold had informed Robin's parents about the death of their daughter the previous night, and even without the results of the autopsy report, he had told them he believed there had been foul play. And so through their complete shock and grief, Robin's parents had given Mangold a list of the few people who had been closest to Robin. And now, Mangold decided to start with her new boyfriend, a bartender named Jared. But the conversation with Jared proved to be pretty uneventful. Jared said he'd been working at the bar the night that Robin had died. He said she hadn't called him or texted him or anything. And Mangold was able to quickly track down multiple people at the bar who corroborated Jared's alibi. Now, the detective had no intention of crossing Jared off his list this early on, but Jared did not jump out as an obvious suspect. And so Mangold figured if Robin's current boyfriend didn't look like a major suspect, well, the next logical step was to talk to her ex-husband, J.D. Spielbauer. Later that day, now over 24 hours after Robin's body had been found, Sergeant Mangold knocked on the front door of J.D.'s house. And as he knocked, Mangold felt a bit surprised by where he was standing, because J.D. lived only a few houses away from Robin's parents' house. The door opened, and a woman who looked like she was in her late 20s with long brown hair and bright blue eyes was standing there. Mangold introduced himself, and the woman said her name was Katie, and that she was J.D.'s wife. She said news had traveled fast, so she already knew about the murder, and she assumed that's why Mongold was here, to talk about it. Mongold nodded, but before he could say much more, a tall, thin man with a cropped military-style haircut stepped outside. He introduced himself as J.D. Spielbauer. But immediately, his wife, Katie, snapped at him and told him to shut up, because she was talking to the police. J.D. immediately hung his head and fell silent. Sergeant Mongold acted like he didn't notice any of that, but in reality, he was taken aback. Married couples, even ones that didn't necessarily get along, rarely lashed out at each other in front of him, especially when they knew they could be potential suspects in a murder case. But Mongold remained calm and polite and asked them where they'd been the night that Robin died. Katie said that she and her son had been at a friend's house, and they had come home around 10 p.m. J.D. said he'd been home all night with his uncle, who also lived in the house. They'd just been drinking beer and playing some pool. Other than Katie's quick outburst at J.D., nothing the couple did after that seemed particularly strange. However, for some reason, Mongold just felt like there was a good chance both of these people were lying to his face. He talked to them for a bit longer, and then as they wrapped up, he told them he would be in touch if he needed any more information. But as he walked back to his car, Mongold already knew he'd be calling J.D. and Katie down to the station soon. He just needed to be better prepared if he was really going to interview them. After leaving J.D. and Katie's house, Mongold drove a few minutes across town to Robin's best friend Aaron's house. Robin's parents had told Mongold that Robin and Aaron were extremely close and shared basically everything with each other. So, Mongold thought she'd be a great person to talk to learn more about Robin, but also, he figured if anybody had inside information on Robin's ex-husband and his new wife, it might be Aaron. And as it would turn out, Aaron knew a whole lot about Robin's ex and his new wife. She told him that at one point, she, Robin, J.D., and Katie had all been friends. But then J.D. and Katie had an affair, and things got ugly. She said Robin constantly worried about the kids and wondered if she and J.D. should really be trying to co-parent them. Aaron also said that J.D. talked a lot about suffering from PTSD because of his time in combat as a Marine. Mongold took notes on everything Aaron was telling him. An affair, a divorce, and a potential custody battle could all be motives for murder. And while Mongold did not believe that all military vets suffering from PTSD were inherently violent, JD's condition was still something he had to consider. But Aaron would tell Mongold something else that would instantly make him rethink his entire approach to JD and Katie. Aaron said late last year, Robin had gone over to JD and Katie's house to drop off the kids. However, when Katie had come in and seen her husband and Robin talking, she screamed, grabbed Robin, slammed her into the fireplace, and threatened to ruin her life. That evening, Sergeant Mongold led J.D. into an interview room at the sheriff's station, and then he sat down next to him at a small round table that was pushed up against the wall. J.D. was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that he kept messing with like he was nervous. Mongold had spent most of the previous night trying to learn as much as possible about Robin, J.D., and Katie's relationship, and he had worked with the phone company to secure a copy of text messages sent to and from Robin's cell phone. Mongold started the interview by asking J.D. to give him an overview of what he'd been doing on the night Robin died. J.D. spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He was polite and addressed Mongold as Sir. And he said basically the same thing he'd told Mongold when they met at the house. He'd been hanging out with his uncle at home, drinking and shooting pool. Mongold nodded and asked if he'd seen Robin at all on that day. But J.D. shook his head and said he had not seen or talked to her. Sergeant Mongold reached down and grabbed a file folder out of a briefcase. He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Then he turned to J.D. and said he wanted to help him because clearly J.D. was having trouble remembering things clearly. Mongold told J.D. that this piece of paper was a record of all the text messages Robin had sent and received on the night she died. and her final text exchange was with JD, just before 9:30 p.m. And it was clear from this text that the two of them had been planning to meet up that night. JD immediately took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. He apologized for lying, and then as he tried to explain himself, he started to stammer. Finally, he got out that Robin was supposed to meet him that night at his house to talk about a standardized test their older daughter was supposed to take. However, JD said Robin never showed up. At this point, Mongold really began to press JD. He asked him if Robin had never showed up, why hadn't he reached out to her? And JD really struggled to come up with an answer. He remained polite and kept calling Mongold sir, but as he was doing that, Mongold got the impression that this was not a man who planned things out, or who could easily organize his thoughts. And so eventually, Mongold told JD that he could assume only one of two things. JD had lied because he was the one who murdered Robin, or he had lied to cover for someone else. JD just shook his head and said he would never hurt Robin. But Mongold snapped back and said, well, if you didn't kill her, who did? JD went quiet for a second, and then he looked up at Mongold and just said, I have suspicions. Now, during this interview, JD did not come out and actually say who he suspected, but Mongold thought it was pretty clear. In fact, Mongold had the same suspicion since he talked to Robin's friend Aaron. So Mongold didn't waste any time. He let JD go, and then had JD's wife, Katie, brought to the station and into the same small interview room. Katie was wearing a sweatshirt with a pink camouflage pattern on it, and while her husband, JD, had looked very nervous when he came in, Katie, on the other hand, just looked mad. But before Sergeant Mongold could even ask her a question, she said she needed him, Mongold, to tell her something. She said she needed to know if JD was having an affair with his ex-wife, Robin. Mongold said he didn't know if that was the case, but he did know that JD and Robin had planned to see each other on the night that Robin died. After hearing this, Katie broke down sobbing and put her face in her hands. She said she knew it. She knew Robin had been trying to tear her marriage apart because Robin had never gotten over JD after the divorce. But despite all the obvious anger Katie felt towards Robin, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Robin's murder. However, despite what Katie and JD said during their interviews, Sergeant Mongold still decided to secure search warrants for their house and their cell phones, and he felt sure he would soon be able to arrest one or both of them. On April 10th, so just 3 days after Robin's murder, Sergeant Mongold and the investigative team searched JD and Katie's house, and they quickly found a room filled with guns. Mongold didn't think that was strange, though. Amarillo, Texas was home to a lot of avid hunters, and most of the weapons in this room were hunting rifles. But one gun immediately caught the detective's eye. Sitting in an open case was a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol. Now, Robin had been shot with a .22. But that was not actually the only thing that made this gun stand out. This gun had hot pink plastic accents on part of the grip and the barrel. And when Mongold leaned down to get a better look, he noticed that part of the pink plastic on the grip was cracked, and that small pieces of the plastic appeared to be missing. And so right away, Mongold assumed that those small pieces of pink plastic that were missing must have wound up embedded in the back windshield of Robin's SUV. Investigators quickly found out that the gun was registered to Katie, and they even found photos she had posted on social media of her holding that gun. And later that day, when police searched Katie's text messages, they found something just as damning. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie had sent 336 text messages to JD, threatening to ruin him and Robin. And the final text message, number 336, which Katie had sent to JD about an hour before Robin had left her parents' house and driven out to Helium Road, said, You started this, whether you want to believe it or not. I will finish it." The Randall County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office moved fast. On April 11th, 4 days after Robin's murder, they arrested Katie. However, before the case could go to trial, the DA wanted either a confession or clear evidence that demonstrated Katie had been driving on Helium Road on the night of the murder. Katie refused to confess. She just repeated her story that she had been with her son at a friend's house and then gone home at around 10 p.m. that night. Now, Katie's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the murder site at the time Robin was most likely killed, but that tower also would have pinged if she was driving from her friend's house to her house, so it was not the definitive evidence the DA was looking for. The search for some elusive piece of evidence that would ensure a guilty verdict began to frustrate the police. After all, Sergeant Mongold and his team had Katie's gun and her threatening text messages to JD, and they knew Katie had once slammed Robin into a fireplace. But Mongold and his team's hands were tied, because the DA's office had taken over the investigation. The DA's office wound up re-interviewing people connected to the case and also scouring surveillance footage from locations just outside of town to see if they could spot Katie's car pulling onto Helium Road. But none of this led to anything new, and the investigation dragged on for months. And so the DA began to worry that he would never find this piece of evidence that would definitively win over a jury. But on a day in July of 2015, over 15 months after Robin's murder, a woman who worked for the DA rushed into his office, and she had a very excited look on her face. She told the DA that she'd seen a story on the news about how certain cell phones left a clear digital footprint when they were connected to Wi-Fi. Essentially, police could use this Wi-Fi data to track exactly where a phone had been, which was far more information than a cell phone tower could provide. When the DA heard this, his face lit up. He'd never heard about this type of search. So he gathered his team, and they immediately got in contact with the phone and internet companies, and soon they were able to trace Katie's exact path on the night of the murder. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DA had been looking for. And not long after that, the DA got another big break when he was contacted by Robin Spielbauer's mom. She told him that she had just gotten this very bizarre phone call that she knew would help his investigation. And the information Robin's mom provided, along with the newly collected Wi-Fi data, finally solidified the case. Based on the information from Robin's mom, cell phone and Wi-Fi data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believed happened to Robin Spielbauer on April 7, 2014. That night, the killer drove their truck through town, trailing just far enough behind Robin so as not to be spotted. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the killer followed Robin out onto a dark dirt road. And after a few more minutes of driving, the killer saw Robin pull over and park. And so the killer slowed down as well and parked right behind her. Once they were stopped, the killer put on a pair of gloves, grabbed a gun from the passenger seat, and then stepped outside, leaving their headlights on. The killer calmly walked towards the SUV, raised their gun, and slammed it against Robin's back windshield. The windshield cracked, and the killer heard Robin begin to scream from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door of the SUV suddenly flew open, and Robin lunged out of the car and started screaming at the killer. But the killer just raised their gun. Robin saw the gun in the headlights from the truck, and she ran towards the farmland that surrounded the road, trying to get away, but the killer followed, and they aimed at Robin in the low light, and they fired. The bullet struck Robin in the back of the head. She stumbled, her body twisted, and she fell to the ground on her back. The killer approached and saw Robin was still breathing, so they aimed the gun at her forehead and pulled the trigger again. But the gun jammed. The killer panicked. They rushed back to their truck, glancing over their shoulder to make sure Robin was not getting up and running off. The killer found a tire iron from the truck bed, took it, and ran back to the side of the road where Robin was still laying on the ground. The killer held up the tire iron and swung it hard into the side of Robin's head. Blood spilled from Robin's temple out onto the ground. Now she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the side of the road. The killer leaned down and took Robin's cell phone out of her pocket. They searched her other pocket for personal items, but she didn't have anything else on her. So the killer walked over to her SUV, leaned inside through the open driver's side door, and grabbed Robin's purse. And then with that in hand, they shut the door behind them. The killer ran back to their truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road back towards their house in town. Once back inside the safety of their home, the killer walked right into their gun room, and they would put the gun they had just used to shoot Robin, a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol with a pink plastic grip, into an open gun case. At this point, the killer took a deep breath and began to calm down. They were convinced the police would eventually find this pink gun, and when they did, they would believe Katie had murdered Robin. Katie Phipps would stay in prison for over a year awaiting trial, while the DA's office tried to find evidence that would ensure her conviction in court. But Katie didn't murder Robin. Her husband, J.D., did. It would turn out that Katie's suspicions about J.D. and Robin had been correct. J.D., who had cheated on Robin with Katie, had now begun cheating on Katie with Robin. But J.D. knew Katie had caught on, and the whole thing had now turned into a total mess. He wanted both women out of his life, so he murdered his ex-wife and framed his current wife for the crime. On the night of the murder, the way J.D. had lured Robin to Helium Road was he had been texting back and forth with her to set up a meeting on that secluded road. That way they could carry on their affair without being seen. Police had considered J.D. a suspect, but the bulk of the evidence they found seemed to point to his wife Katie. She had sent hundreds of threatening text messages, had physically assaulted Robin, and had claimed she was going to, quote, finish what J.D. had inadvertently started. And when tests were run on Katie's gun, the pink plastic from the weapon matched the pink plastic police had found embedded in Robin's back windshield. And so, after only a 4-day investigation, police had arrested and jailed Katie. But over a year later, as investigators and the DA tried to shore up their case before going to court, new evidence came to light. Katie's phone had not been connected to Wi-Fi on the night of her murder. However, her son's phone had. And so using the Wi-Fi data from her son's phone in connection with cell phone tower from Katie's phone, police were able to see that on the night of the murder, Katie's route was directly from her friend's house back to her own house. At that point, they realized Katie had been telling the truth. She did not kill Robin. Also, investigators came to believe that many of Katie's threatening text messages to J.D. might have been about divorcing him and exposing his affair, not about harming Robin. So with this new evidence, police released Katie from jail, and the DA admitted he had rushed to judgment about her guilt. Once Katie was out, investigators quickly turned their attention to J.D. And one of the first things they discovered was that J.D.'s stories about suffering from PTSD were a complete lie, because J.D. had never served in the military. It was just something he lied about to impress women. And so the fact he had successfully carried out this lie for years and had even convinced police it was true helped lead the investigators to believe that J.D. was much craftier than they had given him credit for. They came to assume that everything he told them during the investigation was potentially a lie, and that he had the personality and the mental capacity to frame someone else for murder. And then finally, when investigators really began to move in on J.D., Robin's mom contacted the DA about this bizarre phone call she got. She said that JD had called her and asked her to lend him a significant amount of money so that he could take his daughters on a trip to New York ASAP. With everything else investigators had learned, they saw this as a huge red flag. They believed the reason JD was trying to go to New York was actually just to make a run for the Canadian border. So they arrested JD before he could leave town, and they charged him with the murder of his ex-wife Robin. JD was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll have a chance for parole in 2046. Despite the conviction, some members of the sheriff's department continued to believe that Katie had played a role in this crime. But once she was released from jail, Katie was never arrested or charged again in connection with Robin's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and also Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.